Shortly, we'll begin the 32nd day, Lamed Beth BAOMER, the 32nd day of the Omer. In other words, tomorrow night will be Lag BAOMER. And a great many people have all kinds of ideas about what Lag BAOMER is all about and what happened on this day, and we'll get to that as well. But let us first begin with what Chazal actually tell us, what we find in a number of sources. And let us try and understand what these sources say, because the fact is these sources are not always crystal clear. So you have before you on page 1. Number 1, Aleph. We have the statement of the Talmud as it appears in Masechet Yevamot Daf Samech Bet Amud Bet. This is according, first of all, to the Nusach of the Talmud, the text of the Talmud as it appears in the printed editions. Amru, they, the Chachamim, stated, Shanem Asar Elef Zuchim Talmidim Hayulo the Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, the famous Tana, Rabbi Akiva alav Shalom, one of the greatest of the Tanaim, without a doubt, had, according to this source, 12,000 pairs of students. That means 24,000 students. That is, by all accounts, a very sizable number. One might even say a surprisingly high number. Migvath ad Antipatris, which means basically throughout Eretz Yisrael, something like that. We won't go into the details. We know where these places are. And they all died during a certain period of time. In other words, a well-defined and not very lengthy period of time. In other words, they didn't die of natural causes, as we're about to see. What the statement here says is, surprisingly perhaps, is they died at this time and in this manner because they did not act with respect towards one another, which is also an unusual statement, you might think. And the world, that is to say the Jewish world and the world in general, was desolate. In other words, because so many Torah scholars died at this period, in a short period of time, there was a great vacuum in the world in terms of Torah. Ad sheba Rabbi Akiva eser rabbothenu sheba darom. Literally, until following this event, Rabbi Akiva went further south, towards the south of the country. Ushana'a lahem. The Lashon is a little bit strange, but what it seems to imply is that, and he taught, he made a point of and made great efforts to teach and train other students to replace those who had died. And he taught Torah to these students. Ushana'a lahem. And who are these students? Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Shimon, referring to Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, Rabbi Elazar ben Shamu'a. 5 Talmidim. All of whom, we are familiar with all of these. Chachamim, of course. They are some of the central Tanaim figures that appear in the Mishnah frequently. And it is because of them that the Torah continued to thrive and to exist within the Jewish people. So first of all, according to this, Rabbi Akiva was a very central figure in the Jewish world. This is not news, we know this. He had many students. The figure here is 24,000. Of course, there is the question, why does it say 24,000 in such a fashion? 12,000 pairs, why doesn't it just say 24,000? What does the word pairs signify? Not clear, entirely unclear. As we shall see, there are other nushaot, there are other girsaot of this information, as we shall presently see. But we're reading the printed version at the moment. And despite the fact that all these students died and the world was shamem, was desolate, there was a great lack of Torah was felt in the world, nevertheless there were other Talmidim who were taught, who studied under Rabbi Akiva, and they became some of the central teachers and disseminators of Torah in the world. Tana, it was taught in a Baraita. Kulam methu mi Pesach wa'ad asareth. All of these Talmidim that we spoke of that died, they all died during the period of from Pesach till Asareth, which is a period of 7 weeks. From Pesach till Shavuot. Amar Rav Hama bar Abba Ithama Rabbi Hiya bar Rabin. And then we have the following statement in the name of either one or another Chacham. Kulam methu, or both of them, it's very possible both of them said this. That's why it's recorded in this fashion. Kulam methu mithara'a. They all died, literally, they met a terrible end. Mahi, and what is that? Amar Rav Nahman, Askara. Askara is some kind of sickness, something like whooping cough or something like that, which causes asphyxiation. That's what it states. It's a very there are a number of aspects to what we see here that are surprising. I mentioned a number of them. Let us now see another version of the same information, or similar information. We have the famous Igeret of Rav Sharira Gaon, one of the very last of the Gaonim in Bavel. In other words, we're talking about over 1,000 years ago, about 1,050 years ago. He was the father of Rabbi Gaon, who is considered generally to be the last of the Gaonim, in Pumbeditha in Bavel, in Babylon. And we have an Igeret, a famous document from Rav Sharira Gaon, in which he explains much of the history and the evolution and the transmission of the Torah Ba'al Peh, based on some of the sources that we just saw now, for example, as we're about to see, and also other sources of information that he had. And we have a version of this which appears in this Igeret Rav Sharira Gaon appears it exists in two versions, known as the Nusach al-Sfaradi and the Nusach al-Sarfati, the Spanish and the French version. Without going into a discussion now of which of these two versions is the more authoritative, the more precise, and there are opinions on that matter, but with regards to this specific Piska, with regards to this information here, I think there's no doubt that this Nusach, the Nusach Sfaradi, is the more accurate, at least with regards to this brief section. So it appears in a couple of editions, and the text is as follows. Umasar Rabbi Akiva tasmola hanira. Rabbi Akiva literally acted in such a way, as we shall understand as we continue. He put his life at risk, and eventually he was executed by the Romans. For what? It doesn't say here yet. Ahar sheniftar Rabbi Yosef ben Qisma. Rabbi Akiva was executed after the death of Rabbi Yosef ben Qisma. At this time also, Neherag Rabbi Hanina ben Taradion or Tardion Nif Ma'ata Chochma Aharehem. And because of these events, and as we shall understand more as we continue, there was again a decrease in the study and the knowledge of Torah at this time. So we mentioned here Rabbi Yosef ben Qisma, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Hanan ben Taradion, we know, were executed by the Romans. Malchuth Harusha'a, as we shall see. So this is by way of introduction. Then Rav Shira goes on to say, وَهَعِمِدْ Rabbi Akiva تَلْمِذِيم هَرْبِهِ. Rabbi Akiva had many students. And then Rav Shira goes on says, وَهَوَا شَمَذَا عَلَى تَلْمِذِيم شَرَبِّ Akiva. And there was a shemad. So the word shemad basically means, literally you could define it or translate it as destruction or something which destroyed them. But this term shemad always refers to a government policy, that is to say, usually a non-Jewish government policy, usually with reference to the Romans, who ruled in Eretz Yisrael for a lengthy period of time, as we shall also see in other sources, as we shall proceed. So the word shemada clearly states that these Talmidim died as the result of something that the Romans did. It doesn't say exactly what at this point, but it says that that's why they died. And therefore Am Yisrael had to rely, and did rely, and continued to act and live as Jews and study Torah under the auspices of and by way of the instruction and teachings of the second batch of students of Rabbi Akiva. Da'amur Rabbanan, as the Chachamim stated, 12,000 Talmidim Hayu Rabbi Akiva Migavat Va'ad Antipatres. Here it says you will know 12,000, not pairs. The word pairs doesn't appear here. So we're already half the number, which is somewhat more reasonable, you might think. They all died during the same period that we mentioned, Pesach till Aseret till Shavuot. The Girsah here is a little bit strange. It says that the world was desolate and lacking in Torah until they came to our Chachamim in the Darom, in the south, and they taught them Torah. The language here is a little bit strange. And the name is mentioned here again: Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Elazar ben Shema, the same Chachamim. And they essentially preserved and maintained the Torah at that time. That's what Rav Shira Gaon writes in Igerat Rav Shira Gaon. So, what differences do we see here? We see two essential differences. One is more technical, which is the number 12,000 instead of 24,000. The other difference is that according to the Talmud, as we saw before, as we have it, these Talmidim died of some strange disease because they lo nagu kavod zel lazel. They did not respect each other, did not treat each other properly. And that cannot be described. That such an occurrence, some kind of a pandemic that cuts down so many Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva, it cannot be described as a shemada or a shemad. That doesn't make. The term shemada always refers to that which the Jewish people's enemies do to the Jewish people. So this implies that it's the Romans who are responsible for what happened here, not some mysterious disease. The third source, Gimel, is what we have in Sefer Yochasim. Sefer Yochasim is an extremely important sefer, which, perhaps for that reason, most people never look at. But I recommend that everyone does. We have the original Tfus. We have is very precise and it was written by a phenomenal Hacham by the name of Rabbi Avraham Zakuf, who was from Portugal. Over 500 years ago. He was a phenomenal Hacham. He also happened to be the greatest astronomer of his generation in the world. He drew up the maps that Portuguese sailors used at that time to discover new continents and new passages through the oceans. He dropped those maps. People like what was his name? Da Gama was one of them, and there was another one. He was in touch with these people. They came to him, and he was a tremendous maven in mathematics, astronomy, particularly astronomy, and therefore, because astronomy and cartography have everything to do with each other, so he was the authority. But he was also a tremendous chacham in as a Torah scholar. And he wrote this fascinating sefer called Sefer Yohasim. And there we have the same statement of Rav Shira Gaon, but there it appears in Hebrew. It's translated into Hebrew, which is therefore it's interesting to see how it appears there. And it's the same as the Nusach HaSfaradi of Rav Shira Gaon's Igeret. Rabbi Akiva Masaret Nafsho Lamuth. Rabbi Akiva, well, it doesn't say exactly why yet, but we'll see. He was willing to give up his life. Ahare Moth Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma. Unerag Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion, and also Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion was killed. Neherag, by the way, means, obviously, as in the previous source, Rav Shira Gaon in Aramaic, the Neherag means that he was killed, he was executed. And there was a lack of Torah in the world. Rabbi Akiva had many Talmidim. So the word Shemada in Igeret of Shira Gaon is translated in the Hebrew version that appears in the Sefer Yohasim as Gezerah, which is also, it's synonymous. It's the same term. In the Talmud, sometimes you have a nusach, a girsa, which says Shema, then another nusach that says Gezerah. It's the same thing. Gezerat Malchut, Gezerah. It means the Romans enacted a policy of persecution, sometimes very violent and bloody, against the Jewish people, as we shall see. And Am Yisrael had to rely on the other later Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva. De'amaru 12,000 Talmidim. Here also it says 12,000. Hayu lo Rabbi Akiva migevat ועד אנטיפטרס וכולם מתו מפסח ועד הסרט. והיה עולם שמם והולך עד שבאו 10 רבותינו שבדרום. Again, the wording here is a little bit unusual as it was in the original version. This is the translated version. And the same Chachamim were mentioned. Again, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Elazar, and Shammua. Okay, so we have a general picture of what something happened at this point. It doesn't yet say exactly what. Something happened that resulted in the deaths, the executions of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Hanina ben Teradion and many students of Rabbi Akiva. According to these versions, thousands and thousands. We also have other versions of the same information or similar information in other Chazalic sources. For example, Dalet. Kohelet Rabba, Midrash Kohelet Rabba, it says as follows: Rabbi Akiva Omer, Shnei alafim talmidim hayuli. I had 2,000. It says here 2,000. Obviously, the difference in Shnei Asar or Shnei Asar and Shnei alafim is only one word. If you remove the word Asar, you end up with Shnei. This is the nusach in the Tfus Rishon, Tfus Venezia. I'm sorry, no, Tfus Pizarro. As I mentioned here at the end of the paragraph. Tfus Pizarro is the first Tfus from the year Resh Ayin Teth, which is 1519, Leminyanam. That's the first printing of Kohelet Rabbah. The text is available, I have it. And I checked it, and that's what it says. In other versions, later versions, even not very much later, like in Tfus Venezia, it doesn't say Shnei Alafim, it says Shnei Asar Alafim. The word Asar was added, which fits the nusach that we saw in other sources. But I suspect very much that the nusach of Kohelet Rabbah, the original nusach, is what appears in the first fus, which is what we have here. And we shall see other reasons to believe this to be the case. Shnei alafim talmidim ayulo migevav v'ad antipatres v'chora methu b'hayeh. Rabbi Akiva is speaking here. They all died in my lifetime. They all died when I was still in this world. Ben Pesach la'aseret. Uvesof he'emidu li shiva. And in the end, now it says he'emidu li, which is also a little bit strange. It's difficult to know why it says that, because that literally means other people raised up for me 7 students. It's not clear what that means, but Rabbi Akiva had another 7 students, major students that we know of. Here it says not 5 but 7. وَأَلُهَنْ رَبِّ يُذَا وَرَبِّ نَحَمْيَا وَرَبِّ مَئِبْ وَرَبِّ يُوسَف وَرَبِّ شِمْعَانْ بَنْ يُحَيْ وَرَبِّ أَلِيَزَرْ بَنُوشَ رَبِّ يُوسَف هَالْغَلِيلِي وَرَبِّ يُوحَنَانَ السَّنْدْلَارِ. So the names here are not entirely identical. The names before, some are the same and some others. And these are all Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva. Amar lahem, Rabbi Akiva said to these students, the second batch, towards the end of his life. The earlier students were from an earlier period in his life. And now, he's speaking to the students when he is an older man. Amar lahem, harishonim lo methu ela mipnei shahayatha einehem thara v'torah zeh. Note, it says, my earlier Talmidim died a slightly different version from what we saw before, because they were jealous of each other in terms of their Torah knowledge or their teaching or their understanding of Torah. In other words, their lack of proper respect or proper a correct attitude towards one another had to do with their study of Torah. So they studied much Torah, but they were also they did not act as they should have acted towards one another, and the reason for this had to do with Torah. It's according to this nusach. And therefore, atem lo tiyuken, you must not do the same. Ela miyad amadu umalau umilu miyad amadu umalau et haaretz. The nusach here is mishubash. That's why I left it here on purpose, because it says umalu et haaretz, and then it says kol eretz Yisrael Torah. So as I explained in the footnote, it should obviously read either malu et haaretz or malu kol eretz Yisrael Torah, one or the other, but it actually says both, so I left it that way. This is the nusach in Tfus Pizarro. Then it says Rabbi Kohen. That's what it says in the Tfus. It clearly says Rabbi Kohen, but we're not sure who that is. And other versions it says Rabbi Nathan. So maybe Nathan is more correct here. Rabbi Nathan pathar kiraya bi'isha. The pasuk that we're referring to is the pasuk that we're going to see in a moment. The pasuk is mentioned presently. Pasuk in Koheleth. Baboker zra' zarecha v'la'erev al tanach yodecha. In the morning sow your seed, and do the same again in the evening. Ki enecha yodea as a yichsha. You do not know, you cannot know what the future holds, and which of your activities, your endeavors will succeed. Hazeh or zeh. And perhaps both of them will be successful. You have to do, in other words, hishtadlut. We have to do our hishtadlut always. This is an important lesson, bichlal, that Rabbi Akiva is teaching us. Now, this other chacham, either Rabbi Kohen or Rabbi Nathan, is explaining this pasuk with reference to getting married, having a wife, and procreating and having children. If you got married when you were young, and you had children, and your wife passed away, remarry. Don't remain unmarried. Remarry. Lama, and try and have more children. You do not know which of your children will be successful. It could be successful in terms of physical survival. It could be successful in more spiritual terms. Whatever it is, you don't know what will be. As long as Hashem gives you the power, the koach, the opportunity to do what you are commanded to do, you have to try and do it. This is again a very important lesson, bichlal, in all areas. This is, of course, similar to what Rabbi Akiva did, because he had students and he lost them, and then he ensured that there would be more students. He didn't leave it at that. Im shel na'arutcha, im shel ziknutcha. You don't know which will work out. Im shenehem ke'echad tovim, or maybe both. That's another version. So the difference in this version is, first of all, the number. The number is shnei alafim talmidim, which is a much more reasonable number. 2,000 students. I imagine that was later redacted or changed to fit the nusach in the Talmud of 12,000. So it said Shnei Asar Alafim. That's why we have in Tfus Vilna it says Shnei Asar Alafim, and in Tfus Vilna Shnei Asar Alafim. But I think the original Tfus Shnei Alafim Talmidim is a more likely nusach that the Kohelet Rabbi was presenting to us. And this version also in Kohelet Rabbah is similar in some ways to what it says in the Talmud, in that it says that they died because of their behavior. Their behavior was improper, was not as it should have been. And they were punished. And all of Am Yisrael was punished.
Can I ask?
Yes, of course.
According to this, where did Rabbi Akiva pass away?
When did?
Where did Rabbi Akiva pass away?
Where did he pass away?
Would it?
Where physically? You mean geographically where? Or when?
Where? Because he went...
We know where he was executed. He was executed in Caesarea. The hippodrome in Caesarea, which you can see to this day.
He was north and then he went south to teach in the Rome.
It's a bit strange. There are obviously certain statements or hints here that it's unclear exactly why. It could be that this business of something to do with the south has to do with having to flee from the Romans and hiding, and maybe teaching in hiding and being on the run from the Romans, etc. There are other sources that one could mention. That we have the Gemara in Talmud Bavli and Brachot, Rabbi Akiva, who was on the run, and he had a candle and a cock. Remember the Talmud states that he had a cock, a tarnagol, to wake him in the early morning, and a candle at night to learn by, whatever. But it sounds like he was on the run. Mm-hmm. He was a fugitive. So we don't know exactly. These things happened almost precisely 1,900 years ago. So we just don't have all the precise historical facts. This is the best we. Okay. Comparing all the various sources, we can approach the most likely picture. That's what I can say. So.
How did the word Zulun get added in?
It's very strange. It's not clear. It's not clear. But the fact that in Igeret Rav Shira Gaon, in the regular Aramaic version, the original version, and also in the translated version in Sefer Yochasim, it doesn't have that word. And here we have a figure which is considerably lower, 2,000, and we'll see in a moment an even lower figure. So it sounds like somehow this number became inflated over time. Who did the inflation? I can't tell you. I don't know. But I can tell you that Jews add and do not detract. Many Jews somehow manage to forget what Chazal teach us, Kol HaMosif Goreh. He who adds is actually detracting. Jews like to sometimes inflate things and expand and add, where it's better actually just to leave it exactly as it is. That is the great, that is one of the great characteristics of the Temanim, and also the Yekim, to some extent, and certain other communities as well. They were more resistant to all kinds of newfangled ideas, newfangled nuschaot, etc. There's a reason why the most accurate, there's no discussion, there's no argument that the most accurate nuschaot of Targum Onkelos and Targum Yonathan ben Yonathan are those that the Temanim managed to preserve for so many generations. Everyone knows that, everyone agrees to. That's why all the Kether Mikraot Gedot HaKether Bar-Ilan, That's the nusach they bring. That's why the Musadar of Bar-Hayim also is based on Temani version of Targum Onkelos, etc. It has a lot to do with the fact that the Temanim actually use the Targum. They studied it every week. And when you use something and you use a manuscript before you and you see there's a mistake, you correct it. And you make sure that it's correct, because you're going to have to use it again next week or next year or whatever. But if it's something that's just printed on the page, that's set there hovah, but no one actually knows very much about as to what it actually says, and it's not very important, then obviously things over time just error creeps in. Error is part of reality, right?
But if it's actively being used and being corrected, and as I said with the Bavli and Yerushalmi, sometimes more mistakes make their way in because it's so studied.
Sometimes that's true also. And Rabbeinu Tam knew this, and that's why Rabbeinu Tam was maharim. He made a herem against any sofer who would change in any way the nusach of the Talmud that he was copying. Did that work? Not so much. It would have been better had all the soferim been much more conscious of what Rabbeinu Tam said, because Rabbeinu Tam understood that all kinds of people think, oh, this must be wrong, so we'll change it, we'll add a thing. That makes more sense to me. And they didn't understand the text, but it was perfectly okay the way it was. Just don't touch it. Just copy it exactly as it is. Sometimes that's the best thing is to do nothing. Shev wal ta'aseh. Adif. All right, so now we have another nusach, Ot Hey, in Bereshit Rabbah. Bereshit Rabbah is an ancient Midrash Haggadah, a very large work, and the version that we have there is similar in some ways, at least, to the nusach in the Talmud. It says, Rabbi Akiva Omer, even if you were successful in teaching many students when you were younger, raise up more students when you are old, as long as you're able to do so. I prefer who mechatev alecha. In other words, you don't know which Hashem intends should succeed. Hazeh or zeh, this or these or those. Maybe both. Then it goes on to say, 12,000 zugot. Here it does say zugot. Talmidim hayulol Rabbi Akiva migavat vadanti patre. So it's the same number, 24,000, as in the Talmud. V'chulhon methu v'ferakaha. They all died at the same time. Lama shayatha'inehem thara elu ba'elu. It says again, they did not treat each other properly, and they were jealous of each other. But it doesn't say it had to do with Torah. But in the other source it did say so. So we can assume it means the same. Uvasof Ha'amid Shiva, and later in life, towards the end of his life, Rabbi Akiva had raised up another 7 major students: Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Elazar ben Shammai, Rabbi Yochanan the Sandlav, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. And there are those who say the 7 were as follows: Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Nehemiah, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, Rabbi Hananiah ben Hachinai, Rabbi Yochanan Sandlar. Either way, he said to them, to these students, when he was older, the second later batch of students, Banai, Harishonim lo methu ela shayta'nihem thara b'Torah. So here it's mufurash, it was to do with Torah. They were jealous, their understanding of the importance of Torah, they tried to somehow use the Torah to their own advantage, rather than seeing the objective and overarching value of Torah, that it has nothing to do with you, and therefore it's nothing to do with your kavod, or to do with your jealousy, or how much you know, or how much he knows, or how much people will speak about this person knowing this much or that much. Don't pay any attention to any of those things. They died shayta'inihem thara Torah elu ba'elu. Ela tanu da'atchem shelo ta'asu k'ma'asem. Do not act in this way. Amdu u'malu kol haaretz Yisrael Torah. Okay, so that's here also doesn't mention any strange disease. It doesn't use the word shemada either. It says that they died because they were punished for an improper attitude towards the study and the value and the meaning and the significance of Talmud Torah. Wow. Yes.
And it also just talks about about Perek Echad. Not.
It doesn't say when this Perek was. No, it doesn't say Pesach Ad Aseret. You're right, correct. It doesn't say that. Okay, and we have another source, the last source for now, which is in Midrash Tanhuma. I checked, and in the Tfus Rishon, this section does not appear Bichlal, but it does appear in other later Tfusim, and it says in the Midrash Tanhuma Parashat Hayes Sarah, it says as follows: Rabbi Akiva Omer, Baboker zera et zarecha, v'la'erev al tanach yodecha, ki enecha yodea eze yichshar hazeh ozeh ve'im shnehem ke'echad tovim. The same pasuk as we saw before. In other words, do what you can as long as you can. So in the morning, so in the evening. This is true for Talmidim, this is true for having children. Whatever you can do, when you're able to do, go ahead and do it. Don't rest on your laurels, and don't assume that everything will be okay. You never know what Hashem has in mind. Im ha'amad Talmidim ben arudcha al tehdalach milaha'amid b'ziknutcha ma'aseh Rabbi Akiva shehayu lo shalosh me'ot Talmidim ben arudcha. Here where the number is down to 300. Which actually to me is the most likely number in terms of historical objective perspective. It seems a reasonable, at least in terms of major Talmidim, it seems like a reasonable number. When he was younger, he had 300 students and they all died. It doesn't say why they died. And had he not made sure to teach and continue teaching and studying Torah and teaching Torah and disseminating Torah, lo haya tamid sheyeh koreh al shmo. There would have been no Talmidim known as his Talmidim had he not done so. In other words, again, the stress is on the emphasis is on the importance of always doing the utmost given the circumstances and the facts and your capabilities. Do the most you can at this time. And don't rely on what might be, what might not be. Do what you can do now. All right, so these are the sources. So we obviously there's differences between some of these sources. The difference between 24,000 and 300 is an immense difference. I can't tell you for a fact how many Talmidim Rabbi Akiva had, but I would think the 24,000 and 12,000 are exaggerated numbers. And so it seems to me. Unless you want to say it means, according to the way you can look at it this way, he had 300 major Talmidim, or 2,000 major Talmidim, and they taught other Talmidim, so they were like Talmidei Talmido, and that becomes really exponentially many more. You could explain it that way. We don't know. All right. So what is the overall picture that we can come up with based on these sources? So what I write here is as follows. We have the source in Kohelet Rabbah, Bereshit Rabbah, and Tanhuma. Those are three sources. In those three sources, Mefurash Talmidei Rabbi Akiva Rishonim methu al pano. Here we're told that his original students died during his lifetime. Uvesof Yamav ha'amid Talmidim Nusafim, and towards the end of his life he had more students. And these were the students that really transferred and transmitted the Torah and taught the Torah to later generations. So those are the three sources that agree as to that basic fact. Okay? What else can we conclude? Beth answers on page 3. באשר למספר תלמידו, נוסח התלמוד וכן נוסח איגרת שיר הגאון נראה כלשון גוזמה. The Nusach of the Talmud and Igeret of Shir Gaon talking about 24,000 or 12,000 seem like inflated. These numbers would seem to be inflated. ומפורש בקהלת רבה שמספרם היה 2,000 וזהו מספר המניח את הדעת. A more reasonable number is what we see in Kohelet Rabbah, in the Nusach of Tfus Rishon at least, which is 2,000. Which is also many students. Think about it. Ulefia Tanhuma, there were 300 students, and that's perhaps even more likely. But of course, we can't say with absolute certainty. But it is a fact in all these sources. It's interesting to note whether it's the sources that speak about 24,000 or 12,000, but in the end they all agree there were 5 or 7. That's a huge gap. It's hard to understand. But okay, so maybe the fact that it talks about 5 or 7 also indicates that the original number was not quite so high. Now, what else can we see? In Igeret Rav Shira Gon, there's a big chidush, no question. The biggest chidush there is, it says that the Talmidim died in a shemada, which has to do with the Romans, obviously. In the words of the Sefer Yohasin, Hayta Gezerah, which is again a Lashon that Chazal always use with reference to Roman persecutions. Now, what exactly was this Gezerah? Why did it come about? What exactly happened here? We're about to see in a moment some more sources. Well, here I sum it up, and it seems that we're talking about a Gezerah against the study of Torah, which was one of the Gezerot. There were many Gezerot. There were Gezerot Shemad implemented by the Romans, Yimach Shemam Zichron, after the quashing of Mered Bar Kochva, which we know took place between the years 132, 135, 136, the Minyan HaToim. This was during the lifetime of Rabbi Akiva, as also is also mashma from the Rambam at the end of Ilchot Melachim Milhamot, whereas the Rambam says that Rabbi Akiva supported Rabbi Bar Kochva, whose real name was, as we know, was Ben Kusba or Ben Kuziba. Kusba apparently was the original name. In order to eviscerate the Jewish people spiritually, intellectually, culturally, the Romans wanted to do away with the Jewish people. In other words, and they knew that the ikar of the Jewish, what is the culture of the Jewish people? Torah. So we have to, in order to completely eradicate these pesky Jews who keep rebelling and causing us so much trouble, and they did cause the Romans a lot of trouble, no question, more than anybody else. And Mered Bar Kochva was surprisingly successful and bloody, also for the Romans. The Roman Empire under Hadrian, Shahik Asamov, they implemented a number of Gezerot Shemad, which we know about, had to do with Shmiras Shabbat, Talmud Torah, Berith Milah, all sorts of things. Exactly what happened between the Jewish people and this Rasha, Shahik Asamoth, Hadrian, we know the following. In the year 129, the Minyan HaToim, Hadrian came to visit us. He did a general tour throughout the empire. And in the year 129, 130, he was here in Eretz Yisrael. This is, we're talking about 60 years after Churban Beit HaMikdash HaSheni. Now, the exact order of the events at this point is not entirely clear. There are different versions and different statements in the historical sources. It seems that he decided he would rebuild Yerushalayim, but he would rebuild it in his own image, obviously, right? He wanted to recreate Yerushalayim, but with Salmo, with Mutho, in his image. So he decided to build a Roman colony called Ilia Capitolina, and on Har HaBayit he wanted to build a mikdash, no less, to Zeus and Jupiter. Same thing. Zeus was the Greek version, Jupiter was the Roman version. The Romans were good at stealing things from the Greeks, and and this was too much for the Jews. So according to some historical versions, we have the record of the Roman historian Dio Cassius, and we also have some statements by Eusebius. But they don't always say precisely the same thing. But it's clear that around that time, either after the rebellion was over, as a response to, as a part of the punishment and the response to that rebellion, as part of the Gzeroth Shemad, the Romans outlawed Brit Milah, and this was something the Jews would not accept. There are those who say that he actually made that decree before the rebellion, and that's actually one of the things that led to the rebellion. All right, this is 1,900 years ago. We don't know exactly, but something along these lines. We do know for a fact that as a result, after the rebellion was quashed, the Romans were pretty shook up by the whole thing, and they wanted to do away. These Jews are too much to handle. So we have to destroy them, and we're going to destroy them by destroying the Torah. So we're going to make it impossible for the Beit Din to meet, and we're going to make it impossible to Mekadesh Chodashim, and Brit Milah, and Shabbat, and Tefillin, all sorts of things like that. The famous Gemara in Shabbat, Daf Mentef, Yonah Ba'al Knafayim, with the Tefillin, when he was wearing Tefillin, and this Roman soldier or spy or whatever caught up with him and said to him, "What are you wearing?" and all the rest of it. So there were many gezerot against many aspects of Torah, of Yahaduth. And it seems that what happened was that and we know for a fact there were gezerot against teaching Torah and studying Torah, apparently particularly studying Torah in public, or teaching in public. And Rabbi Akiva ignored this. He decided, and as did Rabbi Hanina ben Teradion, they decided that we cannot acquiesce to such a thing. And they were eventually caught and executed for this activity, as were their students, the students of Rabbi Akiva. That is the most likely explanation, but it's not the only possible explanation, as I'm about to say. So that's one possibility. We know for a fact that the punishment for transgressing these, for contravening these Gezerot Shema, these various measures, was death. There was only one punishment. We know that, as we shall see in a moment. It is also possible, and has been suggested, that the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva died in the rebellion, in the war against the Romans. That they were part of the army of Shimon ben Kusba, Bar Kochva, and they died in in Beitar and the battles before Beitar. For a time, Ben Kusba Hamelech, as Rambam refers to and Chazal refer to in a few places, was very successful. For a time, he was the practical ruler of Eretz Yisrael, or at least part of Eretz Yisrael. Mainly Eretz Yehuda. Not so much the Galil, apparently, and maybe not at all in the Galil. And it took some time for the Romans to regroup and bring huge reinforcements, etc., etc. But eventually, that's what happened. So there is this claim, but there's no explicit and no obvious proof for this. But the term Shemada can be interpreted as referring to Milchama. In other words, the war, the actual rebellion and the fighting against the Romans can also be referred to as Shemada. And they died as a result of the Romans fighting back and trying to put an end to the rebellion. All right. Now, what do we know about the Gezerot Shemad? We have a statement in the Talmud Bavli Masechet Avodah Zarah, which is now number 3 Aleph. It says as follows: Daf Yod Het Tano Rabbanan. Our Chachamim taught. Keshehala Rabbi Yosef ben Chisma. He was already an older man, and he was simply on his deathbed. Halach Rabbi Hanina ben Teradion levakero. Rabbi Hanina ben Teradion went to visit, or to be with him, to see him for the last time. Amarlo, Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma said to Rabbi Hanina, Hanina ahi, ata yodea, שאומה זו מן השמיים המליכוה? Do you not know that this nation, this Malchut Rasha'ah, these Romans, have been placed in charge of the world for the present time? Min hashamayim, this is the will of Hashem. You cannot simply imagine that you can resist them and beat them. Min hashamayim himlichu. In other words, it's Ratzon Hashem, for whatever reason, that they have this power and that they rule. And how do I know this? He's explaining, how do I know that this min hashamayim? She'ehriva et beitho, this malchut of the Romans. Ehriva et beitho, v'sarafa et hechalo, v'harega et hasidah, v'ibada et tuvo, v'adayin hi kayemet. They've done all these terrible things. They destroyed the Mikdash and they killed so many chachamim and did so much evil. And yet they're still around. And they're only gaining and going from strength to strength. This is true, by the way. The time of the period of the revolt of Bar Kokhba is generally regarded as the high point of the Roman Empire in terms of their power, and the extent of the empire, etc. Wani shamati alecha, and yet I hear about you. Shata yoshev v'osek b'Torah. Now, what's wrong with that? That you sit around studying Torah and teach people. Umakhil kihilot barabim. You gather large gatherings of Jews. V'sefer munach lach b'hakecha, and you have a sefer Torah, apparently a small one that you have holding on, and you teach Torah. Maybe you read from and you teach Torah, barabim, openly, to large numbers of people. And Rashi explains there, Shata Yoshev Osek B'Torah. What's wrong with that? Wahem Gazru al Kach. So you're risking your life and maybe the lives of many others. And Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma was of the opinion that this is not going to work. I'm not in a position to express any opinion on the matter. I'm just saying that's what Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma said to Rabbi Hanina. Amar lo, what did Rabbi Hanina say to him? Min hashamayim yirahamu. It's in the hands of heaven. I have to do what I have to do, and I hope for Rahmah Shamayim, that Hashem should have Rahamim on me and the rest of Am Yisrael. Rabbi Yosef was not very impressed with this answer. He said, Amar lo, ani omer lach devarim shel ta'am. I'm talking facts, realities to you. You know what I'm saying. You hear what I'm saying. It fits the real world. V'ata omer li min hashamayim yirahamu. You see that Hashem min hashamayim himlichu et ha'umah zo. He allows them to get away with literally with murder and worse. Tamea ani im lo yisrafu afach v'et sefer Torah ba'esh. I will not be surprised if they end up burning you and your sefer Torah together. Now, if you ask, what did Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma think the Jews should have done at this time? We don't really know. Maybe he thought that the Torah should be taught underground in some kind of partisan underground system, underground hidden Batei Midrash, not in public. It's hard to know what he thought. Clearly Rabbi Yosef didn't think this was the way to go, but he obviously, on the other hand, didn't think that Am Yisrael should just resign from being Jews. That's not what he thought also. And here we have a very interesting exchange. It says, in other words, Rabbi Hanina said to Rabbi Yosef, who was older than himself, and he refers to him as Rabbi, Ma'ani lahaya olam haba. What will my status be b'olam haba? Which is an interesting question. How is he supposed to know? So he says, Amar lo kalu ma'aseh ba'ali yadach. Well, can you give me an example of what the kinds of things that you did, that you do? So there's an interesting story. He won't go into all the details. It just says basically, ma'oth shel purim nithatfu li b'ma'oth shel tzedakah v'hilaktim la'aniyim. In other words, there was some confusion with money that I received to give to aniyim, either for purim or for purposes of tzedakah, and there was a halachic issue whether I can give it for this or to that person or for this purpose. So I ended up paying from my pocket. Amar lo im ken mihelkach yeheh helki u'migoralach yihi gorali. In other words, atat tzadik gemur. In other words, your place in B'olam Haba is very great. Amaru, lo hayu yamim mu'atim ad sheniftar Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma. Rabbi Yosef, as we said, ben Kisma was on his deathbed. He died. Now here it says something strange. V'halachu kol gadolei Romi lekivro And all the great Romans, important Romans officials went to his funeral. Why would they do this? Not very clear. Not very clear. It could be that they saw him as someone who was willing to work with them and not be so completely opposed to them in every way. And maybe for that reason they wanted to show people that if you work with us, we will, we will show you great respect, etc. It's hard to know, but that's what it says. Again, we don't know the details. When these Romans were returning from his funeral, again, as why did it happen in this way? We don't know, but it says Rabbi Hanina ben Teradion sheya yoshev v'osek b'Torah u'makil kilot b'rabim. They caught Rabbi Hanina ben Teradion teaching Torah in public. V'sefer Torah munach lo b'heko. Heviuhu uchrachuhu b'sefer Torah. They wrapped him up in the Sefer Torah. V'kifu b'havilei zmurot v'hisaytu ben va'ur. Basically, he was burnt at the stake with the Sefer Torah. V'heviu sevorim shesemer ushraum b'mayim v'nichum al libo. They wanted to make an example of him, and they wanted to make his death as gruesome as possible. Kedei shelo teseh nishmato mehera. So they covered him with damp pieces of cloth and what have you to draw things out. There's a well-known story here about his daughter. Amralo vito Abba erech bechach. In other words, Rashi explains there, Zot Torah v'zos schara. Now this is what I have to see. Amarla ilmele ani nisrafti levadi. Haya davar kasheli. If I was only being burnt by myself, that would be, it would be difficult enough in my eyes. But then I saw in some of Farshim, then perhaps also I would think to myself that maybe this is what I deserve for whatever reason. In other words, I would not be toheh al midato shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I would accept the din of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is what has to be. However, achshav shani nisraf v'sefer Torah mi, but if they're burning the Sefer Torah with me, mi shemevakesh elbona shel Sefer Torah hu yivakesh elboni. In other words, it's clear that it's not because I deserved it, because the Sefer Torah didn't deserve it. Machon? It can't be the Sefer Torah didn't sin or act improperly in any way. So it's obviously some strange gezerah which I do not understand, and Hashem yivakesh elboni, and Hashem will avenge me. Okay. That's one version. So what do we know? Why do I quote this? From this well-known Agadah, which is clearly reporting and relating to us historical events, even though we don't know all the details. As we said, some of the statements here are difficult to truly penetrate, but we understand that Rabbi Hanina ben Teradion ignored, as we will see with regards to Rabbi Akiva, he ignored the Gzeroth Shmad. He taught Torah Barabim. That's what he decided he had to do. The Mesirut Nefesh, of course, is beyond belief. That goes without saying, and this proves to us, teaches us that, as we know from many other sources as well, this was one of the Gezerot Shemad, one of the Gezerot of the Romans in the wake of the Bar Kokhba revolt, not to allow the Jews to study Torah. So from this we also understand that we should, if the Romans understood it, we should also understand it. That the essence of the Jewish people is Torah. Jewish culture, Jewish civilization is Torah. Other nations have statues and paintings and what have you, and music. Not that music is a bad thing. Some music is wonderful, but it is nothing compared to Torah. And the Romans understood this. And if you want to weaken the Jews, weaken their connection to Torah. And that, of course, therefore, for us is a very great lesson. We have another statement in Talmud Bavli, Masechet Berachot, Daf Samech Aleph, here with regards to Rabbi Akiva. It says, Tanur Rabbanan, Ma'aseh u'Gazara Malchut. Again, the word Gezerah Malchut always refers to the Romans. Malchut HaRasha'ah, the evil king, the wicked empire of the Romans. Shemad al Yisrael shelo ya'asku b'Torah. And in one version it says, V'chol ha'osek b'Torah yidaker b'cherev. Whoever is caught doing so will be executed by the sword. Bar Papos ben Yehuda. Who was this person? He's mentioned in the Talmud another occasion as well. We don't know much about him. Papos ben Yehuda, he came to Rabbi Akiva. Shaya makil kilot barabim osek b'Torah. So Rabbi Akiva was of the same opinion as Rabbi Hanina ben Teradion. This is what I have to do. This is my response to the Roman persecutions. They want us not to study Torah. I will go out of my way to teach Torah. And if they kill me, so mote it be. Amarlo, so this Papos ben Yehuda said to Rabbi Akiva, Eya tam ityaru mipnei malchut, or another nusach, me'uma zo, which is actually very similar to the statement that Rabbi Yaakov ben Kisma said to Rabbi Hanina. He said, don't you know that Hashem for now allows them to, this is a Rasha that has been given Rashut to do terrible evil at the moment. Omarlo, emsholach mashal, I'll give you a mashal to explain my behavior. Lama davar domeh, l'shu'al, sheyam alech al gav nahar. A fox was walking along the riverbank. V'ra darim sheyu mitkabbasim mimakom lemakom. And in the water he sees many fish darting from here to there. Amar lahem, mipnei ma atem borachim, why are you constantly darting and running away? Amrulo, mipnei rashathot shemevi'im aleinu bnei adam, because of all the nets, the people are coming to fish us, to take us out of the water. Amar lahem rathonechem sheta'alu le'yabasha, so why don't you come onto dry land with me? V'nadhur ani wa'atem kashem shedaru avothaim avotechem. What is meant by those words is less than clear, but the idea is, it's not good. You're not doing well on the water. Come and be with me on dry land. Obviously, his intention was clear. Then I'll be able to eat you. Amrulo atahu shomrim alecha pikach shebahayoth. You're the animal that's referred to as the cunning fox, the wisest of the animals. Lo pikach ata ela tipesh ata. You're a fool. Oma b'makom hayuthenu anu mityoreim. Here in the water, things are bad enough, and we have to be concerned and fear the people with their nets and their fishing rods. But makom mithathenu, if we go onto dry land, which is for us is death, ala hath kama v'chama. Obviously it's worse. We're better off here, not with you on the dry land, that's for sure. Afanachnu achshav shanu yoshim v'oskim b'Torah. We also, says Rabbi Akiva to Papos ben Yehuda, when we study Torah, we're like fish in the water. There are dangers, but we're in the water. We're in a makom hiyuth. We're in a place where we can survive. Shekathuv ba ki hu hayecha borach yamecha, because that is our life. Without that, we're nothing. Kach im anachnu olechim mitbatalim mimena ala hath chama v'chama. If we cease studying Torah because of the Romans, then our situation will only be worse, not better. Amru lo hayu yamim mu'atim ad shetefasuhu l'Rabbi Akiva v'havashu v'et ha'asurim. It didn't take too long before the Romans arrested Rabbi Akiva and put him in prison. With Hafasu lePapos ben Yehuda v'havashu v'et tzlan. And the other Jew, Papos ben Yehuda, we don't know why, but he was also caught up in the dragnet of the Romans. Amar lo Papos, Rabbi Akiva said to him in the jail, Ma mi heviach lechan? Why are you here? Amar lo ashrecha Rabbi Akiva. How good is your portion, Rabbi Akiva? Shenithpasta divrei Torah. You were arrested by the Romans for divrei Torah. Oy lo lepapos shenithpasta divreim betelim. We don't know what he did, not clear. But I wasn't arrested for as good a reason as you were. B'sha'asha hosi with Rabbi Akiva laharicha, when they executed Rabbi Akiva, and again you can actually see the place where Rabbi Akiva was probably held right before his execution in the hippodrome in Keistera, which is right near the coast, near the sea. The ruins of the place are there, and very real and very haunting if you go there. I've been there. In other words, they made a public spectacle of it, the Romans. Zman Kriyat Shema, it was the time for Kriyat Shema. I assume it was early morning, but I don't know. Wayu Sorakim et Besaro, B'masrekot shel Barzel. This is something which is also not very clear. I've heard people who know more than I do about Roman practices, and this kind of method of killing people is not very well known. It's not clear what it means, but whatever. They did everything they could to make a spectacle of Rabbi Akiva. והיה מקבל עלו מלכות שמיים. In one version, the word old doesn't appear, and I think that's the correct version. והיה מקבל עלו מלכות שמיים. And Rabbi Akiva was saying קריאת שמע. אמרו לו תלמידו רבנו עד כאן. This is your דבקות בשם is so great. אמר להם כל ימי הייתי מצטער על פסוק זה בכל נפשך. In other words, בכל לבב ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך. אפילו נוטל את נשמתך. אמרתי מתי יבוא לידי ויקיימנו. In other words, the limud on this pasuk is well known, that you must be totally dedicated to Hashem, even if it means that you lose your life. And now that I have a chance to actually perform this, I should not do so. ועכשיו שבא לידי לא יקיימנו, היה מעריך באחד שיסד נשמתו באחד. This is a well-known statement in the Talmud, the end of Brachot. Yasaf bat kol ba'amura, I should say probably Yasaf. Yasaf bat kol ba'amura, and a heavenly voice said, Ashrecha Rabbi Akiva sheyasa nishma nafshach be'achad. He died as he was reciting the pasuk of Kriyat Shema. Amrul Machon lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu zot Torah v'zot sechara mimetim yadach Adonai mimetim me'halad. Rashi explains there. In other words, we should die at your hand, not at the hands of Rashaim. Amar lehem halkam b'Hayim. The rest of the pasuk says halkam b'Hayim. In other words, these people, such people like Rabbi Akiva on a special level, v'zeh l'shivcham. Yasaf bat kol amara ashrech Rabbi Akiva shta muzuman l'chaya olam haba. Okay, so there's these two ma'asim. There are many others, but these two ma'asim related in these two places in the Talmud Bavli, Avodah Zarah and Barachot, clearly indicate that there was one of the Gezerot Shmad of the Romans against the Jewish people after the rebellion of Rabbi Akiva, of the Bar Kokhba, which Rabbi Akiva supported. But it doesn't sound from here that he was executed for that reason. It sounds like he was executed for teaching Torah and refusing to accept the Romans, to live according and to act according to their expectations. So we know that this is what happened, and many other things happened. And this period is known in the language of Chazal as b'sha'at sakana. There are places in the Tosefta and the Talmud where it says b'sakana, like Ner Chanukah. It says b'sakana, you light the candle in your home and on the table, not at the window, because there was nothing else that you weren't allowed to do at this time. You weren't allowed to light Ner Chanukah outside, or in the window even. So from all this we see clearly that the Romans understood that which unfortunately many people do not understand, that Am Yisrael without Torah is an impossibility, and Am Yisrael is able and willing, and has always been willing, to be nosel nefesh, to remain Jews, because to live physically and not as a Jew, as a goy, it's not for us. It's meaningless. That kind of existence is meaningless to us. And Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Hanan ben Teradion are two outstanding examples of this. But of course there are many others, both Chachamim and Talmidim, and according to what we saw before, it sounds like many of Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim were killed for the same reason, because of this. They're studying Torah and teaching Torah, etc. So it seems. Okay. Now it's known, as it's quoted by the Geonim already, some of the Geonim and Rishonim, that this period of Sfirat HaOmer from Pesach to Aseret, or at least to Lag BAOMER, there are various minhagei aveluth, various mourning practices, which are always associated in these sources. The Geonim, the Rishonim, they're always associated with the deaths of the death and the destruction of the Talmidim Rabbi Akiva. There is no mention of any mourning practices in the Talmud. Chazal did not mention any such period of mourning in connection with such an event. What we saw in Masechet Yevamot, etc., we saw that there were Talmidim and they died between Pesach and Aseret, but it doesn't say anything about mourning. But the Gaonim speak about this, the Rishonim speak about this. There was obviously a minhag going back a long time, a long way. Morning practices at this period. But Chazal clearly did not institute any such morning period. And the question is, why not? My conclusion, already going back many years, decades I suppose, is the following: that Chazal intended that all the various historical events and calamities and tragedies that befell the Jewish people should be commemorated at the beginning of the month of Av, when there was clearly a well-known, well-defined and very ancient mourning period from the time of the Nevi'im, immediately after the Churban Bayit Rishon. So we're talking about going back 2,600 years. So we have Thum HaRavi'i, Wa Hamishi, Wa Shavi'i, etc., Wa Asiri. So this was the well-known, well-established period of mourning in the Jewish people for national calamities. And we also see the Mishnah at the end of Masechet Taniyot, in the passing of the Masechet Taniyot, Moed, yeah, Mishnah with the Rambam. Yeah. We know that Chazal concentrated many various events, or commemorated various events in the same period. So in the Mishnah, at the end of Masechet Ta'aniyot, it says, Hamisha Devarim, the last parak of Ta'aniyot, Hamisha Devarim era'u et avotenu b'shiv'a b'Tammuz, 5 different events or tragedies, calamities occurred, befell our forefathers on the 17th of Tammuz, b'Hamisha b'Tisha B'Av. Then it goes on to mention the 5 of Tisha B'Av, of Shiva B'Tammuz, and the 5 that took place on Tisha B'Av, or around Tisha B'Av, because we know that according to the says in Sefer Yirmiyahu, Sefer Melachim, the first Mikdash was destroyed on Shiva B'Av. And it goes on to say in the Mishnah, with Tisha B'Av nichzal avotenu shelo yikansu la'aretz, so Het HaMeraglim is included here. Harav Habayit Barishona Vashniya Nirkada Beth Tor is Bethar V'Nechrasha Ha'ir, and that was also part of the shmad against the Jews after, and some say even or just before, that led to the revolt of Bar Kokhba, that the city being plowed up and also being prepared perhaps for new building on Har Habayit and what have you. There is, by the way, an individual today by the name of I can't remember. I won't remember his name right now. He's an archaeologist, but that's not his main. In other words, he's not a professional archaeologist, but he and someone else and a few other people discovered years ago a huge amount of archaeological finds. Basically, we're talking about pieces of metal onto which were scratched Hebrew letters, which are essentially letters between Bar Kokhba, Shimon ben Kusba, and some of his associates. I won't go into all of it now. You can hear some of the discussions about this on YouTube, whatever. They did produce some document which sort of lays out in writing what they discovered there. It seems to me there's no doubt that these findings are authentic, and it tells a very fascinating story. What I understand from what they have published thus far is that one of the major reasons for the rebellion was to protect the Aron HaBarith, which was hidden in the bowels of Rabbi. And the Romans were intending to rebuild, or to tear apart part of it and rebuild it, as we see here. SHIUR maybe is connected to that. We know they were going to build this Ilia Capitolina. They're going to build a temple there. And Aron HaBarith, according to this, was definitely hidden somewhere in the depths of Rabbi, in some secret chamber, which only certain people knew about. Very, very few people knew about. Kohanim, and apparently Shimon ben Kusba knew about this, and the intention was, why did they attacked the Roman garrison in Yerushalayim, and in particular in Rabbi, in order to take over Rabbi, which they did, in order to smuggle out Aron HaBarith, which what we understand from these sources is that they succeeded in doing so, and they hid it somewhere else and buried it somewhere else. According to these people, they claim they know where it is, but they're not willing to say, or at least not in public, for various reasons, which I can well understand. This is a long discussion, but it's interesting. It's a very, very interesting thought that this entire event may have been the result of a desire and more than a desire, an absolute need to protect Aron HaBarith from falling to the hands of the Romans. So, at any rate, we see from this Mishnah that different events were commemorated on the same day or the same period of time. So then we have the well-known statement of the Mishnah later. Shabbat shahal tisha b'av liot b'tocha asorim melasaper melchabes b'hamishim u'trim mipnei kvod haShabbat. So we have this period of mourning, the beginning of Av, up till Tisha B'av, up to and including Tisha B'av. It seems to me that Chazal did not think it was correct and proper to institute a separate period of mourning for these tragedies. First of all, if you commemorate the Chuban Rishon, Chuban Sheni, it does mention, also says Himufurash Bethar, in other words, which has to do with the rebellion of Bar Kochva. So it's being specifically referred to in the Mishnah here in Taniyot as being commemorated on Tisha B'Av. So this actually proves my point, that Chazal intended that even events that took place much later, and maybe they did take place around Tisha B'Av, maybe even on the day Mamash, that they be commemorated at that time. As I have pointed out before, if you take the periods of mourning to do with Tisha B'Av, Chodesh Av, and the other various fast days, and you add to that 7 weeks of mourning from Mipesach ad Asereth, then you end up with something like 18% of the year. It's not healthy, normal for people to be in national mourning 18% of the year. It's not a correct response to a difficult situation. Chazal wanted to concentrate and limit the Aveluth to a particular period of the year, and whatever happens should be at that time. That's why I say, for example, Yom HaShoah should be in Av and not in Nisan. I'm not the first person to suggest that also. So,
how about Yechidim? Like Rabbi Sadok, he was Nista'er, he was Mit'aneh, a lot.
Yechidim, that's a very different question, but לגזור על הציבור זה משהו אחר, right? כידוע אין גוזרים על הציבור גזירה שאין הציבור יכול לעמוד בה. יחידים can always decide to do various things לפי שיקול דעתם, especially אנשים גדולים, great people. But for the ציבור, for the am, you cannot behave in such a way. That's what I think. That's how we should understand the fact that Chazal nowhere at all do they suggest that there should be a special period of mourning to do with a separate period of mourning to do with Bethtar, with the Mered Bar Kochva, Talmidei Rabbi Akiva. All right, so we have this mourning period that is mentioned in the Gaonim, mentioned in the Rishonim, talks about not getting married, talks about not cutting one's hair, what have you, which is also an interesting and strange minhag, because if you do not trim your beard, cut your hair for an extended period of time, it's going to come at the expense of Kavod Shabbat at some point, within a few weeks. a month and a half at the most. Machon. And then I think another reason why the minhag, the way it developed, I think is therefore a popular minhag. In other words, העם נהגו מצד עצמם, מאליהם, שלא על דעת חכמים, or even בניגוד לדעת חכמים. That's what I think actually happened here. Because even with regards to, we just read it now in the Mishnah, even with regards to Shavuot Shehal Bo Tisha B'Av, even when Tisha B'Av falls on Friday, so that week of Tisha B'Av, you cannot cut your hair, you cannot trim your beard, you don't do laundry, what have you. But on Thursday, Erev Tisha B'Av, you're allowed to do all these things and to bathe and to wash and to cut your hair. Lichwa the Shabbat, which is going to be immediately after Tisha B'Av. Erev Tisha B'Av, you do all these things. In other words, Shabbat overrides the Aveluth. And this, the minhag as it exists today, is stating the opposite. No, this Aveluth of Rabbi Akiva and Sfirat HaOmer overrides Kvod Shabbat. This is not something, in my view, that Chachamim could possibly have sanctioned. And therefore it's not surprising to me that there's no mention of such a thing in the Talmud, and it doesn't surprise me that the Rif doesn't talk about such a thing, the Rambam doesn't talk about such a thing. The Rambam certainly knew of such a minhag. There's no way he could not have known about such a minhag. If Rabbi Yitzchak ibn Giat knows about it, well before the Rambam, he also knew about it. Other Geonim as well. But he chose not to talk about it because he obviously thought this was an unbalanced, ill-advised minhag. That's what I think Chazal would have thought about this. That's what the Rambam, I think, thought about this. Now, we also know that it has become totally it's unchallenged. It's an article of faith that Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai passed away on Lag BAOMER. Well, as we said before, all sorts of things, strange things happen sometimes in Jewish history, and this is another example. There is absolutely no evidence whatever, and there's absolutely no reason to believe that Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai passed away in Lag BAOMER. And I don't want you to believe me, but you can believe the Hida if you wish, because the Hida writes this mefurash, and it has nothing to do with not being a mekubal or not being against Kabbalah. The Hida was a great mekubal. The Hida writes in his book Marit Ayin, and I give you the precise source, Hilikutim Zayin Od Het, he says, מה שכתבתי בברכי יוסף שיש שכתבו שפטירת רבי שמעון בן יוחאי הייתה בל"ג בעומר, כן כתב בספר, there's a Kabbalistic work by the name of Pri Etz Chaim. And it does say that there, it's true. But it's also not true that book is full of mistakes, we know that. And it's what the Hida says, אך כבר נודע שבנוסחאות כתבי הארי היה ערבוב וטעויות סופר, והנוסחה האמיתית היא נוסח שמונה שערים שסידר רבי שמואל ויטל, ושם בשאר הכוונות העריך בטעם שמתו, וכתב שרק בעומר הוא יום שמחת רשב"י, not יום שמת רשב"י, יום שמחת רשב"י, ולא בא בפיו לומר שהוא פטירת רשב"י. By the way, in the Pri Etz Chaim, even there, it says, in the original, the first printing, which I've seen, it says, Yom Sin Mem Geresh. Yom, and then Rashbi. And this was understood, read by some, as Yom Shemeth Rashbi. But it's not, it's Yom Simchat Rashbi. So that's what the Hida is telling you. It was an abbreviation which was misunderstood. And this is the beginning of this legend about Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai passing away in Lag BAOMER. In other words, the chance that the probability that Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai passed away in Lag BAOMER is precisely equal to the probability that he passed away on any other day of the year. So you can figure out the mathematics of it. I'm not a mathematician, but the probability is exactly the same as any other day of the year. And the Hida says so mefurash. And he says it again in his Ha'arot לברכי יוסף, אין ספק שלשון שאר הכוונות מורה בבירור שיום ל"ג בעומר אינו יום פטירת רשב"י, אלא יום שמחה הקשורה עם היותו מתלמידי רבי עקיבא האחרונים. That's also not very clear what is the simcha all about, but the fact is that it's not yom ptirat rashbi. But today, of course, all kinds of people will tell you, Chachamim וכאלה שאינם כל כך חכמים will tell you that it's Yom Rashbi, Yom Hilula, and people go to Meron. I mean, what happened some years ago in Meron as a result of the insanity, and which was only an accident waiting to happen. Anyone who saw what goes on there would understand this. By the way, the Ben Ish Chai, also a well-known Makubal, says exactly the same thing. He writes in Daf Tevuna on page 4, exactly the same as the Kidah. There's no proof whatever, no indication anywhere, not in the Zohar, not in Kidvei Ari, no place that Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai passed away on Lag BaOmer. If there is any rational explanation why Lag BaOmer became a day of celebration and a day of bonfires, it has been suggested by some. Again, the proof for this is not very. There are a number of indications. We know of, for example, a minhag amongst the Ashkenazim, which is mentioned in Sefer Tamei Minhagim, all kinds of strange books talking about minhagim. It says on Lag BaOmer, the teachers in the Cheder, in the Talmud Torah, send the children out to play with bows and arrows on Lag BaOmer. Send them out into the forest to play to play bows and arrows and soldiers. You send you mevatel Torah, and you send children on Lag BaOmer and why dafka Lag BaOmer to play with bows and arrows and play soldiers in the forest. This obviously indicates something to do with some kind of warlike activity, rebellion, fighting. It has therefore been suggested, and it's quite possible, in fact, maybe even likely, that Lag BaOmer was a day in which they commemorated some great victory against the Romans, because at the beginning the Romans were on the run. The Bar Kokhba managed to beat them and destroy a whole legion of the Romans that they brought here. And it was a great blow for the Romans. So apparently Lag BaOmer was one of these days when something the Jews won, was successful against, and this ancient shared memory, this national memory of the Jewish people, retained this information down to the present day in the form of this minhag of sending children out to play with bows and arrows, and also bonfires can be connected to such a thing. Bonfires, of course, were used in ancient times as a sign, as to communicate, often in times of rebellion or something. It was a sign that that we're here waiting for you, or you're supposed to start doing something over there, whatever it is, right? So the connection between Kabbalah and Lag BaOmer, to put it simply, is non-existent. Lo haya v'lo nivra. It all is all based on this spurious and mistaken reading of what it says in this book, which is also not very precise always, Priyetz Chaim, as we saw here. And even there it doesn't say that Rabbi Shimon died on this day. It was misread and misunderstood, and it became a big deal. We also don't know for a fact there's no proof that Rabbi Shimon is buried in Meron or near Meron. No proof of this at all. But this is how legends and stories and what have you grow up. I remember when I was 11 years old, it was just before we were here. At that time, we lived, I and my family lived here for a short time in Eretz Yisrael, and it was just before we left Eretz Yisrael at that time, Tisha B'Av, and not Machon Tisha B'Av, Lag BaOmer. We left in Av, but this was Lag BaOmer, and that was the only time in my life, as I recall, that I've been in Meron on Lag BaOmer. My father took me there. I think he also wanted to see what goes on there. I remember very vaguely, at least as a child, I remember seeing very strange goings on. It was basically a huge kind of picnic, barbecue event, and it was unclear exactly what was going on. And I think to this day it's very unclear what goes on there, except for the fact there's a tremendous amount of, shall we say, underhanded financial practices that go on there. Many amutot and many people, I think, make their entire year's parnasah from what goes on in Lag BaOmer, or related to Rashbi, selling people, getting them to donate so that someone will daven in Meron or Lag BaOmer for them or something. All sorts of kunsim of this type. So I remember all kinds of very simple people sitting around and just basically having a barbecue. Which is something which I know for a fact that this is what's been going on there for years. Now it's all of a sudden because of what happened some years ago, where many people died, unfortunately, because of the total lack of reasonable control and regulation of what was going on there. That so now they're limiting the numbers of people, and it's somewhat more organized. But it's well known that some people would go to Meron 2 weeks in advance in order to set up a tent right next to the Tziyun, next to the Kever, so supposedly, who knows who was buried there, if anyone. And so they would be right near the event, and they lived there for 2-3 weeks before. Total insanity. But if there's anything that one can understand from all of this, it is the fact that the Jewish people do require a focal point, to a place that attracts them, people where people gather. And yes, barbecues or a Korban Pesach type of activity is something that the Jewish people want and need and require. And the Torah tells us exactly to do such a thing, except not in Meron, but on Har HaBayit. So all the things that go on, or not all, some of the things that go on in Meron around this time of year should be transferred, should be transplanted to Har HaBayit, to the Mikdash, because that is what people want, and that's what people need. A very powerful experience when many people come together and gather on the background of some spiritual theme and idea. And that's also the reason that, one of the reasons, so many people like to make barbecues and go out and what have you on the Yom Tekumat Yisrael Hei B'Iyar, or whatever day it's celebrated, on Yom Ha'atzmaut, for the same reason. That is a healthy, normal, and can be a very positive experience if it is done as it should be done. If it's out of control and run by all kinds of very dubious people with even more dubious ideas, and it becomes a place where the main activity is to go to Meron and buy some red thread that they sell you for 5 shekel to put around your wrist or something. All right, well, that is ziluth shel hayadut. That is not what we are all about. Yes, any questions?
Did have followers of the Rambam, such as Rav Kafech, not in any way observe anything related to this period of Lag BaOmer, or did they sort of deviate from the Rambam?
I don't recall speaking to Moriah Rav Kafech about this particular point, but I do recall speaking to some elderly Temanim many years ago, whether Minhagei Avilut were kept in Teman during Sfirat HaOmer. And one old man, I remember very clearly, said to me, he was from Aden, and he said in Teman, and he said that we didn't, this whole minhag of not cutting one's hair, one's beard, etc., we didn't have any such minhag at all. When Yichvot Shabbat, when it was necessary, we cut our hair as usual. Lo haya davar kazeh. And it's also a fact that in the Teshuvah, famous Teshuvah of the Radbaz, as I recall, he mentions that there are some communities that have this minhag, other places that don't. In other words, it wasn't universally accepted. Nowadays it seems to be much more universal, but it wasn't always that way.
So Lag BaOmer as well was not observed in any way?
No, well, it depends where. Again, amongst the Ashkenazim dafka, it's more obvious that amongst the Ashkenazim, going back further in time, there was something special about Lag BaOmer, but what it was, no one really knew. The main expression of this special day was that the children got a break from school, and they went out and were allowed to play or something. But it doesn't seem very clear. No one seems to know exactly why. But the moment you hear that children are playing with bows and arrows on Lag BaOmer, that obviously suggests something. But in the Sephardi world, where the impact of the Kabbalah was much greater, it immediately became wrapped up, and it was totally absorbed by the world of Kabbalah and all kinds of ideas, and this statement in Priyat Chaim, which was misunderstood. So it became a celebration of the Gilui of the Kabbalah and the Zohar, and there were all sorts of things of this nature, which of course is totally baseless, without any basis in reality or history, whatever. And should that surprise us? No, it doesn't have to surprise us, because all sorts of strange things can happen and do happen. Anything that can happen will happen. So if something can go wrong, it eventually will go wrong. If strange ideas take root and people let their imaginations run away with themselves and people have various agendas, then all sorts of things will grow up and be invented. And that's what happened with BAOMER, etc., etc. So the reason given, by the way, I didn't quote it here, but I've given a SHIUR about this in earlier, other occasions going back many years. For instance, in Shara Kabanoth of the Ari, in the Haggadah, there you will see that there it gives the reason for not cutting hair during Sfirat HaOmer. It says explicitly it's nothing to do with Aveluth. In other words, the minhagim mentioned by Geonim and Rishonim going back well over 1,000 years, where it was always connected to some kind of Aveluth to do with Talmidei Rabbi Akiva, and that fits the fact that the minhag was also not to marry, for example, during this period. The certain Mekubalim explicitly state it's a mistake. People who think it has to do with Avedut are completely wrong. It has to do with some fancy, difficult, impossible to follow Kabbalistic idea to do with Sarot HaZakan, and this has to do with Rabbi Akiva, Gilui Torah. B'kitzur, it becomes a completely different and foreign concept. Nothing to do with Avedut, nothing to do with any gzera or shenad or anything at all. It's a completely different thing, and it even contradicts the Torah, what it says in the Talmud. So it just shows you that in the world that is referred to as the world of Kabbalah nowadays, there are many, many strange and unusual practices and ideas which are very suspect, and we should not be in a rush to buy into such things. So if your final question is, should you buy a ticket to go to Meron tomorrow, I would recommend not doing so, for many, many reasons, not the least of which is that you'll spend hours in traffic jams. Tov, Rabotai, Namod Bazeh. Ken?
So based on all the earlier sources that we saw, it seemed that the Talmidim passed away between Pesach and Aseret. Where did this idea develop, though, that it was only the first 33 days, the last 33 days, like there was only some chedek of this time?
It's not clear. It's not clear. There's even a difference in terms of minhagim today between the Ashkenazim and the Sfaradim, right? According to the Ashkenazim, as the Rama writes, Lag BaOmer is already considered a happy day when you're allowed to cut your hair. According to the Sfaradim, as the Beit Yosef understands it, you cannot cut your hair on Lag BaOmer, you have to wait till Lamedalet BaOmer. So everything here is completely strange and unclear, and it bespeaks obviously strange, confused ideas, amalgams of ideas and concepts and stories that somehow were fused together over time, and
So would the Rav recommend to observe some sort of Avedut, or I understand for the 4th Shabbat, one should obviously cut the hair, but let's say in the week.
Agaon Rabbeinu Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik Zatzal was also of the opinion that Lichot Shabbat during Sfirat HaOmer is mutar and miswa listaper, and that's what I tell people always. Also, with regards to tisporeth, with regards to not getting married, for example, for weeks and weeks or whatever, or almost 2 months, that's also a very strange minhag. Certainly in the case of someone who is not married, does not have children, it's a very extreme practice. But it is dafka the more extreme and unusual and strange practices that tend to grab people's imagination for some reason.
So
that's something that needs to be addressed to psychologists, apparently.
So if not for the fact that it would be causing mahloket, it would be permissible to get married during this time?
I'm not the first to suggest it. It's already mentioned the Beit Yosef. He quotes opinions to that effect, that someone Mishaloki Emperor Mutar Litchaten. Okay, whatever. It's practically speaking, if a person has such a problem, they don't know what to do about how to get married during Sfirat HaOmer, so let them come and talk to me. We'll figure it out. We'll figure out what to do. But the Rabbanut will not do so during Sfirat HaOmer until Lag BAOMER, as I understand it. Set up.
But before Rosh Chodesh Iyar, they would allow, because there are people that do that.
Machon. There are people who do it before, up to and including Rosh Chodesh Iyar as well. Okay. טוב, רבותיי, היו ברוכים, חזקו ומאמץ לבבכם, כל המייחלים לאדוני.